Hello, I'm Tom Gregory with Youngstown Christian Television. Thanks for joining us on the YouTube channel here and watching the program that you're about to see. Before you do that, if you could hit the subscribe button and join us, that way you'll always be informed of what's going on with Youngstown Christian Television every time we put a new video up on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much. We appreciate that.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.
Welcome to Discovering His Story, an attempt to bring together the accounts of history along with what the Bible has to say about what occurred. Last week we were looking at Noah's Ark, and we ran out of time, frankly. And so I want to go back to some of what we were saying about Noah's Ark as we look at the size of the ark. Remember, this program is being brought to you by Youngstown Christian Television, and so make sure you check out the other programs that are available as well. So, looking at Noah's Ark, this is an artist's rendition of what the ark looks like. If you look at Genesis chapter 6, when God tells Noah to build an ark, he tells him what kind of wood to use, gopher wood. I don't know that anyone is certain what that means exactly, but it must be a good wood for keeping out water. He was to cover it inside and out with pitch. Bitumen is another word that's used in ancient language for that. And then we're told in verse 15, this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Now I remember what Bill Cosby said when he did his comedy routine on Noah. He said, "Right, what's a cubit?" Well, not many of us know what a cubit is, and it's kind of a guess even among historians. But it appears as though a cubit is around 18 inches, give or take. Now, if we compare the ark to the size of other ships, we can see the comparison. So you can see a ship called the France or Queen Elizabeth I, the Queen Mary, the United States, and then at the bottom you see the Ark of Noah. So the Ark of Noah was smaller than many of our large ships today. Of course, everybody always wants to compare it to the Titanic. So there it is on the right. The Titanic is 882 feet long, the Ark 450 feet long. And you can see the other measurements that are given for both of those. But the Ark is obviously smaller than many of our large ships. Well, the question arises in many people's minds, how did Noah fit everybody, all the animals that is, onto the ark? And not only that, but all the food for all those animals to live on the ark. Well, if you go down to the ark encounter in Kentucky, which is built back to Genesis, started by Ken Ham, you'll see that they have a very good display of how animals were kept. And consider too that animals that were put on the ark probably were not fully grown, mature animals. They would be young animals. In fact, I'll suggest to you even that there were dinosaurs on the ark. Because dinosaurs are reptiles, they continue to grow throughout their lifetime. That's why before the flood, we find evidence of these huge reptiles, which we call dinosaurs. But if you take a young dinosaur, he's relatively small, and then he'll continue to grow throughout his lifetime. So there was room on the ark, and the Creation Museum gives us a good example in the Ark Encounter of how they may have been able to keep all those animals and all the storage of food as well. One of the things that's very interesting about the ark is to consider its shape. You know, again, it was not made to go anywhere. It doesn't have a stern and a bow like most ships do, or any way to propel it. It was not made to move. It was not made to travel. It was made to float. And that's what it did. Interesting, a scale model of the ark was tested in a special tank at Scripps Institute of Oceanography at La Jolla, California. I'm not sure if they pronounce it with Spanish, La Jolla, but anyway, it's with a J. The tank was capable of generating giant waves with respect to the model boat, thus simulating severe sea conditions. Now, they do this for models of any ships that they're hoping to construct so that they can tell whether they're seaworthy or not. And so someone did that with the ark. And what they found is that using waves much larger than will be experienced in the ocean, that the ark proved impossible to capsize. Due to the rectangular shape, it proved capable of righting itself even to 90 degrees. This is unheard of an ocean-going vessel. Most vessels will develop severe stability problems at more than a 60-degree list. The ratio of the ark is 30 by 5 by 3. It turns out that this design is a perfect design to prevent capsizing in rough seas. Should we be surprised? God gave Noah the exact measurements needed to make sure that the ark did not flip over. Even so, there were problems on the ark. As it says here, if they sing, row, row, row your boat one more time, I'm jumping ship. And then there's the problem that Bill Cosby brought up. And who's going to clean up the mess in the bottom of this boat? With that, let's take a short break and for a couple of commercials, and we'll come back right after that to talk more about the ark.
This 19th century painting by Edward Hicks and the basic dimensions taken from Genesis in the Bible have given Day and his team inspiration to build an exact scale model of the ark. To simulate a heavy animal cargo, the model ark is weighted. A 220-foot wave tank will simulate storm conditions that the ark would have likely encountered in the flood. Motion detection cameras will record the model ark's behavior in the water using stability markers at the back of the ship.
Now, this kind of test that we're doing here, we're mostly interested in the motions of the vessel. And in this particular case, this is an unusual vessel because it's not a powered vessel. So we're looking at a vessel that's free to float in the water.
Computers will analyze the ark's movements.
You okay there, Charlie, then? Okay, we'll go for it.
Dave fires up the huge pneumatic wave generator. On board, Noah would have had no power to control the direction of his huge ship. And as soon as the waves hit the bow, the ark quickly swings to the most unstable position. The boat is now taking the full force of the swell, side on. The motion detection camera picks up the degree of movement.
This is the image of the balls on the boat, and these are the motions of the vessels, which we're also recording here.
The ark is pitching and rolling dangerously as the wave machine reaches storm conditions so extreme that one of the marker balls actually disappears underwater.
We've got a peak roll angle of over 50 degrees. You would be thrown around all over the place. You'd be literally hanging on for grim death. The real boat, which wouldn't be 100% watertight like our model is, would be sinking.
To make allowance for how a wooden boat built at the time of Noah would leak uncontrollably, the team removes the deck and runs the test one more time. It soon takes on water and begins to list.
I think it's trouble now. It's going. It's going to go. There it goes. More and more water comes in, and the boat just progressively floods, and then in the end there's a loss of stability, and the boat sinks quite dramatically in that case.
Marine engineers believed the violent rolling and pitching would allow floodwater to pour into the hull. With leaking planks and decks, the Ark doesn't stand a chance. But Ark supporters believe Noah had the technology to stabilize his boat in rough waters. And 13 miles west of the Durapinna site, Bowen finds the evidence. In 1977, Ron Wyatt discovered these strange stones. Based on his knowledge of ancient Egyptian boats, he thought these stones could have been tied beneath the hull, the hanging weights keeping the Ark steady in rough water. As the flood receded, Wyatt believed Noah cut them loose, and they fell here.
What we believe happened with these stones here, as the ship would roll and pitch, this would swing back and forth and up a little bit as the ship would pitch and roll, similar to a shock absorber in your car. And it's slowing down that momentum that would be created from that. So quite amazing that Noah's Ark would use that kind of technology.
To find out whether Noah's supposed technology works, Day has added weights beneath the model Ark. This time, he's programmed in even bigger waves.
Now that, without the deck, would definitely have been over.
Amazingly, the Ark survives the giant wave impact. The stabilizing anchors have worked. Without them, the Ark would have turned over.
Welcome back to Discovering His Story. We're talking about Noah's Ark, and I want to finish up what happened with Noah after the Ark landed. If you look at Genesis chapter 8, you'll see that after they came off of the Ark, Noah and built an altar to the Lord, took clean animals to sacrifice to Yahweh, his God. And then Yahweh gives him a covenant, makes a covenant with Noah. We call it the Noahic covenant. And he says, I will never again curse the ground on account of man. For the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth, and I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. And then we see in chapter 9 that God then gave an indication of this covenant by putting what we call a rainbow in the sky. Actually, the Hebrew word is simply the word bow. And one possibility of its meaning may be that illustration of God taking his bow, that is, that implement of warfare, and placing it on the wall. And that would be the bow then that we see after a rain, which has all those wonderful colors in it. And so that rainbow was a symbol of God's mercy in not bringing again destruction of the earth by a flood as he did at that time. Of course, today, the rainbow has been co-opted. I'm glad to see that at the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, Ken Ham's organization, that they actually have a rainbow over the entrance. They say, we're not going to give up the rainbow. That's God's sign. One of the things that Noah is told by God is that from then on, capital punishment would be in force. That is, whenever someone shed another person's blood, that they would have to give their lives as well. If you kill someone, that you are to give your own life. And he also tells Noah to be fruitful, multiply, and populate the earth abundantly, multiplying in it. In other words, going throughout the earth. That was the covenant then that God talks about in verse 8 of chapter 9 and following. There are a number of things that we can go into there, but this is not our purpose to go verse by verse. One other thing I want to point out, just because of something that I read that might be an explanation. We're told that Noah started farming, and apparently he had brought grapevines with him on the ark, so he planted those. He had enough time for those to ripen, and he made wine out of them. I've heard people say that Noah sinned in getting drunk. One author I read, however, posited a different idea, and that is that because of what happened during the flood, that is, the water canopy that was around the earth created a greenhouse effect around the earth, so that there were no temperature changes per se, not the extreme changes anyway, and very humid. It also would have affected the pressure of the air pressure. And so when Noah made his wine, being in a different atmospheric environment, he may not have realized that a little bit of wine went further. And because of that, he got drunk sooner than what he might have expected. I don't know if that's really the case or not, but I thought it was an interesting hypothesis. We see what happens with his son, Ham, and uncovering his father's nakedness, or see his father's nakedness. We have the other sons, Japheth and Shem. These three sons are then the ancestors of all the people of the world. All come from those three sons, and some of them are listed for you there in chapter 10. Not long after that, there was a rebellion, and that was at a place that was called Babel. As people moved forth from the ark, some of them went to the east and southeast and settled in the area that we call Mesopotamia. So it was there that many of them decided that they were going to go against the instructions that God had given, that Noah had given, in fact, to them as well. And they didn't want to scatter throughout all the earth. We're told that, in fact, they were building a tower so that that would not happen. Now here is one rendition of the Tower of Babel, as it is well known. We're told in chapter 11 that the whole earth used the same language, the same words. And they settled in Shinar, which is the ancient name, for the area of Mesopotamia. And so they built they made bricks and were building a tower. Now, if you ask almost any child who's been in Sunday school, and most adults, what was the purpose in building the tower, I guarantee you that probably over 90% of them will say they were trying to get to heaven. They were trying to get to God. Well, that comes about as a result of a misunderstanding of what the King James Version was saying. If we look at a more modern translation, we see that they say, "Let us build a tower whose top will reach unto the heavens." It's plural. It's not heaven singular. It's plural. They weren't trying to get to God. They were building a tower, we're told, and then the very next phrase, "Let us make for ourselves a name, otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the earth." Why'd they build the tower? Because they didn't want to be scattered. They wanted to stay together. They liked being with one another. They built a tower. It possibly had a function of worshiping the stars, things like that. But primarily it was so that they wouldn't get lost. So if they went out beyond the area in which they were living, they could always find their way back by looking for that tower in the sky. That's the reason for the tower. And it's a direct disobedience of what God had said to do. So the Lord, Yahweh, decided that he was going to put a stop to it. And without going into all the details of what happened, we know that Yahweh came down and confused the languages so they couldn't understand one another. And what transpired then is that people that could understand one another, spoke the same language, moved off together, and so God scattered them whether they wanted to or not, because that was the only way they could understand one another. This is how the nations were dispersed according to what we're told in Genesis. You can see the different names of tribes as they went forth from the area of Shinar down into Africa, east over into Asia, and then eventually also northwest into Europe. All descendants of the three sons of Noah. Here's another map showing many of the same areas, a little bit different texture to the map that you might like. And also a website where you can find it. Interesting that this was a stamp put out by the European Union, the Common Market. They wanted to bring Europe together, bring all the languages and cultures together under one. Interesting that they chose as their symbol the Tower of Babel. Might there also be some rebellion against God there? The Tower of Babel, a symbol of unity, where in the Bible, the Tower of Babel is a symbol of disobedience. This is what a representative in the European Parliament said. More and more, the European Union is like a Babel tower. The drive is to keep building the tower higher and higher to make it reach heaven. But if we keep building without common sense, the tower will collapse on our heads. Well, that's certainly true. The next question we have then, people ask sometimes, well, where did all the different races come from? If everybody goes back to Noah, then why do we have so many different colored people? From light skin to dark skin to reddish, yellowish, all the different kinds of people that we have in the world. Well, that doesn't mean that it didn't come from the original same parents. Because in reality, there are not races. There's one human race. There's one race, the human race. Everything else is just different degrees of melatonin, different shades of color. We're all the same on the inside. We're all human beings. If you look at the variation in DNA between human individuals, it shows that racial differences are trivial. This genetic unity means, for instance, that white Americans, although ostensibly far removed from black Americans in phenotype, can sometimes be better tissue matches for them than are other black Americans. If you look at on the left there, the variation between individuals in human DNA is 0.2%. Within a local ethnic group variation, for example, Cantonese, it can be 85%. Between ethnic and linguistic groups within a race, like the Cantonese and the Japanese, it could be 9%. Between races such as Asian and Caucasian, it drops down to 6%. So in other words, there can be more variation within a so-called racial group, I would call it an ethnic group, than there is between humans in general. We all go back to the same ancestors, which is demonstrated by our DNA. Now, what about all the years that we hear about in the Bible, all the years that people lived? Well, without going into a lot of detail, I think that largely that could be explained by a canopy of water that was around the earth. There's disagreement about that even among Christians, so I won't belabor that too much, but I think it does help to explain why people lived so long before the flood and why the years went down afterwards, as you see in this chart. Adam, from creation, lived 930 years. Lamech, who is mentioned in Genesis, lived from 874 to 1651 years after creation. And then Noah comes along 156 years after creation. Notice that he's not all that long after Adam died. So Noah definitely knew people who knew Adam. And then Noah lives beyond the flood 206 years after creation. Terah, the father of Abraham, is born during the lifetime of Noah. And then, of course, Abraham follows him. Not too many years after Noah. Can you imagine that Abraham could have talked to people who knew Noah? Amazing, isn't it? And I think that longevity occurred because of this protective canopy around the earth that in part came crashing down upon the earth when the flood occurred. Well, next week we hope to, whoops, I forgot one thing. I wanted to go back to this. No, I think I pretty much covered all of that. Everything else is within the human race. Next time we're going to be looking more specifically at some of the civilizations that developed right after the flood because people getting off the boat didn't lose everything that had been designed before, or had been known before. And so we're going to be looking at those first civilizations that occurred, see how they developed. We're going to see where they're mentioned in the Bible, what interactions there may have been between biblical characters and characters that we find or civilizations that we find in the historical record. So I hope you'll enjoy that and come back and join us then. We're going to proceed from there to looking at all the major civilizations and see how the biblical people and events interacted with those great civilizations. I think you'll be amazed to see what occurred and what influence the biblical characters had upon these civilizations, and vice versa sometimes as well. So our goal here is to examine history according to the truth, and that means integrating what's happening in the Bible with what is occurring in ancient history. And that's why we call it Ancient Times, and why we call it His Story. So join us next week. Watch the other programs on Youngstown Christian Television.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story. Okay, tax time again. What's it going to cost me this year? Well, that seems high. That's a lot more than I thought. Is everyone this expensive? Here's a local company. Let's check them out. They've been around for 15 years. Average fee less than $79. I'm going to tax 29. They have an office near me.
Verse 1 of chapter 5, now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven not built by human hands. We know. The Christian faith engages our minds. This is something that we have to keep reminding ourselves of so that we don't allow our minds to fossilize and that we continue to be sharpened and to make progress. I was at a church in California just a few weeks ago now, back in August, I think it was, time flies, and I went there. I had a Sunday free, and I was staying with friends, and I went down to the church, and I was excited because I get to go now, and I don't have to do anything at all except do whatever they tell me to do. And so I sat there, and I waited for it to begin. And it was quite fascinating, actually. They had big screens, and they had a clock on the screens, and when I got in, it said 5 minutes, and I'd only been in about 2 seconds, and you won't be surprised, it said 4 minutes and 58 seconds. And then it counted down, and eventually when it counted down, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and just right on the moment of time, the band began, and